Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. That ought to cover when you're watching this video. I'm Bill MacTiernan from Schenectady, New York, and I am an amateur woodworker. And by amateur, I mean I don't charge money for the things I produce. But I've been woodworking for 45 years. I make period furniture reproductions, and I know what I'm doing. Molly, if you would pan my shop from this wall around there, you can see the tools I have in this shop. I have actually two shops. This is my main shop. My other shop is where I do carving mostly. Now, when you get through panning the shop, you'll notice something. I don't have a table saw. I never have had a table saw, and I've been woodworking for 45 years, and I never will. In my other shop, I have a lathe, a hollow chisel mortiser, a jigsaw, and a DeWalt radial arm saw. I like this shop because it doesn't look like a suburban kitchen inside. Now, we're going to talk about that radial arm saw. But first, I need to talk a little about the terrible rumors that are being spread about radial arm saws. And there are two of them. And one is they're not good for ripping. And the second terrible rumor is they're dangerous, more dangerous than a table saw. And both of those are untrue. And I will tell you why, and I will show you why. Okay, before we get to me telling you why and showing you why, we need to understand some terminology. There are three terms that you need to know, and they are ejection, kickback, and climb. And in order to understand those, I have a little mock-up here. This is a mock-up of a table saw. I'll put it out here. Molly, can you get a... This is a mock-up of a table saw. This is a mock-up of what my fingers would look like if I owned a table saw. And I'm going to use this mock-up to talk about terms. First term is ejection. Ejection happens when the blade comes up out of the table, you push the wood through, and when the inside piece of wood cuts free, the piece of wood between the blade and the fence shoots directly out that way. It ejects just like that, using the fence as a guide so that its trajectory is determined by the fence. The second thing I want to talk about, the second term, is kickback. Kickback is totally different than ejection. What kickback is you're pushing wood through the table saw. These back teeth are coming up out of the table. And what happens is the back teeth catch the side of the stock, lift it up until it gets to the top of the blade, and then swivel it. And they throw that stock out like a frisbee on an arc over in that direction. And the thing about kickback is, if you're holding this stock in here, when it kicks back and throws it out that way, pulls your fingers into the blade. Kickback is the most dangerous thing a table saw does. Now, if you don't believe me, there's a couple of videos I like to recommend. One is called Kickback on Camera, which has slow motion of kickback, and it's a scary thing. And another video is called Conquering Kickback. The way to conquer kickback, of course, is a riving knife on the saw. If you have a table saw, watch them both. It'll make you a safer woodworker. Let's look at a radial arm saw now. I've got this blade a little askew, but this is the direction you would rip on a radial arm saw. It goes into the blade, so the teeth are turning this way. And when the wood breaks free, out down here at the tangent of the blade and the table, you can get ejection. Ejection will drive the wood straight out and parallel to the fence. But when you get to the back of the blade, You don't have saw teeth coming up out of the table. You have saw teeth going down toward the table. So what it's trying to do at the back, the teeth are driving the stock into the table. In short, a radial arm saw does not kick back. It does not do the most dangerous thing that a table saw does. That's the chief reason why ripping on a radial arm saw is safer than ripping on a table saw. But what are the advantages of a radial arm saw? First, it's an inexpensive tool. The saw I'm using is 45 years old. I bought it new for $350, if I remember, and it was about 1/3 the price of a good cabinet saw. I think the ratio is still about the same, except that radial arm saws have been so denigrated over the years, and the fact that old geezers like me all bought them and now their estates are selling them. They are cheap. Used ones are down to around 50 bucks. The radial arm saw that I have in my other shop at DeWalt, which is a better saw than a Craftsman, I bought for $10. And the people that sold it were happy to get rid of it. Okay, so they're inexpensive. The other thing is, radial arm saws are not in the middle of the shop. They're up against the wall. Molly, come over here. The reason you can put a radial arm saw up against the wall is that you turn the head. When you're cross-cutting, your stock is, say, in a shop east-west, and when you're ripping, you turn the head and your stock is east-west. On a table saw, you can't turn the blade. So if you're cross-cutting east-west, then you need to have room on both sides of the saw east-west. And if you're ripping on a table saw, you're ripping north-south. So you need room north and south on the table saw. In short, the table saw has to be out in the middle of your shop. This tool doesn't. This is a great tool for a small shop because you need the middle of your shop for assembly. Okay, that's one advantage. There's two advantages, actually. Lastly, these saws are great for cross-cutting. It should be obvious that it's easier to cross-cut on this saw than on a table saw. I've kept track of my saw usage over a period of a year. Now, I make period furniture, so I do not use sheet goods, but about 70% of my cuts are cross cuts. Don't you want a saw that is the best for 70% of the cuts you do, rather than a saw that's good for 30%? Okay, now I need to look at this particular saw. It's been modified a little bit. First, this saw is set up to run on 220 rather than 110. I don't think that affects the power of the saw. It affects the efficiency with which it runs and the voltage that it draws. Amperage, voltage? Amperage, the amperage it draws. Okay, so it runs more efficiently. The second thing about this saw is that this is a new table. This saw is about 45 years old. This table is about 5 years old. It's a little heftier than the original table that came with the saw. It's made up of 2 sheets of MDF glued together. The original chipboard table fell apart after 40 years. But this is about the same size table that came with the saw. Here's the most important thing about this particular saw. It's this blade. This blade is a thin kerf, 24-tooth ripping blade. It is the only blade I use. I use it for every cut on this saw. All these other blades, 60-tooth, 80-tooth, they don't work as well as this blade. On the package of this blade, the manufacturer says this blade will cut wood like a hot knife through butter. Well, that's a bit of hyperbole, but it is the best wood cutting blade I've ever come across. Now is the time to explain climb. Climb Climb is what happens if you pull a saw blade too fast through the stock. Basically, it stops the blade. The blade wants to climb up. It's not particularly dangerous. It's very bad for the tool. A climb is exactly what is used to stop a saw if you put your finger into it. They put an aluminum block into the saw and it stops the saw dead. That's what's happening if you have climb on a radial arm saw. Saw blades with teeth that are neutral, at a neutral angle, are supposed to climb less. They don't. This blade cuts better, so the better it cuts, the easier it is to get through the wood and the less likely it is to climb. It also, if you pull it slowly, gives you as smooth a cut as any other blade. If you buy a new one, a new radial arm saw, there are some guards that hang down here. This one never had it, and I've never bothered to get them. I don't think you need them. That would be your choice if you buy the radial arm saw. This comes with guards. The guard over the blade moves forward during ripping, and there are anti-ejection paws which move down and back during ripping. One more thing. This saw is set up to my next to my drill press. The drill press table serves as an outfeed table. It's about 1/4 of an inch lower. So that if in ripping, I can use it as an outfeed table. I can also use it to hold stock when cross-cutting, to hold up the end of the stock. Some woodworkers build their radial arm saw into long tables. The problem with that is that when you are ripping, when you get to the end of the piece you're ripping, it's best to step around this side of the table where I am now and push the board through the saw. If you have a long table that goes out that way, then you're leaning over and it becomes dangerous. Okay, I've palavered enough. Now is the time to do some cutting. All right, so let's do a cross cut. This is a piece of 6/4 mahogany, Honduras mahogany. I'm going to put a line on there, and I'm going to cross cut it on that line. Here's a nice thing, the line's on top. The saw blade's on top. I can see exactly where the teeth are going to come on that line. I know that if I put that right there, I'm going to leave just about half the line. Are you ready to cut? No? Okay. See any light there, George? Light there. Pretty good. All right. One thing you should have noticed is I didn't yank the saw through the wood. I pulled the saw slowly enough so that the blade cut easily. This is a nice, smooth, 90-degree cross cut. Let me see. Let me do one more. This is a piece of 1-inch sapele. Sapele is a relatively dense tropical hardwood. I'm going to put a wedge on the back end so it holds it wherever I want it. There, I've got it exactly where I want it. suppose I want to fit this into a location, it's a shelf or something, and it's 128th of an inch too long. What am I going to do? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull the saw out, and I'm going to push the wood into the blade so it deflects the blade ever so small an amount. If you've done this a couple times, you can get used to it. You can deflect the blade a 1/16 of an inch. Just depends on how hard you push. Hold the wood there, push the saw back. Now I just took about 128th of an inch off the end of this Sapele board. It's something I use all the time when I'm making furniture. Let me show you the next thing about cross cutting. Okay. Multiple cuts with a stop. I mean, it seems simple, but there's something you need to know. Suppose I want to make 4 legs that length. Clamp a stop to the fence. And that I can put any piece of wood in there, it'll cut it exactly the same length. But here's what you need to know. You have to hold the wood between the stop and the fence. Otherwise, when the cut comes free, this could get canted out and jammed into the blade. So you change the way you hold the wood. Let me do that cut. Really good for making table legs. What if the table leg is longer than the table on the saw? Then you need a fence like this, which clamps on this way. The clamp goes here, and the stop is out here in the air. Multiple table legs. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is angle cuts. I use this saw to cut 45-degree angles, or any angle you can think of, but you don't see any markings in the table from doing those cuts. So here's how I do it. A piece of MDF with a 45-degree cut on it. The way to make that is you get your trusty carpenter square, put it in there, take your piece of MDF, put it on the saw, clamp it on, and make that cut. That gives you a 45-degree angle that's as good as your carpenter square. The second thing I've done to prepare this is I glued some sandpaper on here. This is 150 grit sandpaper, which helps a lot. So, let's make a 45-degree cross cut. That's picture frame accurate. I have also used this saw to do scarf joints for boat building. In which case I didn't use this fence, but I clamped the fence like that. It comes out here and clamp long 8-foot pieces of stock on. When it's clamped on, you just need to pull the saw. You don't even need to put your hand anywhere near it. So any angle cut you want, it's better to make it with a jig, simple jig like this, than it is to move this arm. You lose accuracy on the 90-degree cut if you move the arm. What's the word? Small pieces of wood. That's a small piece of wood. That's a piece of wood that's 3/4 of an inch square and 1 1/4 inches long. I'd like it to be 1 inch long. Now it's 1 inch long. Now it's 1 inch long. I don't think you can do that on a tabletop. Last thing. Oh! Tenons. I told you I use this blade for everything, even making tenons. So let's make a 3/8 inch tenon on the end of this piece of wood. Just what I'm doing is setting the saw so it's approximate. I'm getting an approximate 3/8 inch tenon. I'll trim it up with a shoulder plane once the cheeks are cut. I'm setting up a stop in the middle of the tenon so it'll stop it when I turn it over also. All right, I'm going to do one side, then the other. That's a pretty good tenon. It's a little over 3/8 of an inch thick, but a few cuts with a shoulder plane and it'll be right down there. Well, so much for cross-cutting. Now let's talk about ripping. Here's a piece of 7/8 inch cherry. I pre-measured this. I want to cut a piece about 6.5 inches wide. So let me move the saw out to about 6.5 inches. I'm going to cut off the bark. I'm going to move the front of the front guard down to about 1/4 inch above the wood, surface of the wood. And the anti-ejection pawls, by the way, manufacturers call these anti-kickback pawls. They're wrong. They're anti-ejection pawls. Bring that back. If you look at the way the blade is covered, it's covered from the front and in the back. The guard that brings down the pawls covers the back of the blade pretty well. It's pretty hard to stick your fingers into that blade, but you can if you want to. Now, when I'm ripping, I always use gloves. And the reason is you can grip the wood better, and secondly, you want to push it in through the fence, and you want it to slide past your hand. And if this is a hard edge, you can fill your fingers with splinters. So I just use gloves, period, when I'm ripping. I want to get a push stick so it'll be available when I need it. All right, let's rip this. Nice, clean. One thing you do need to do is to clean off your table. It tends to get some sawdust on it. Let's do another rip cut with that. Let's take it into about, take it into about an inch. A little less. So we'll cut on the inside. I'm going to need a different push stick. I need the push stick because when I cut off that inch or less inside of this, it'll tend to eject, and I don't want it to do that. It'll get stopped by the pawls back there, but using the push stick helps, gives you double protection. So let's make this cut. Okay. Let me clean up this table a little bit, and then I'll answer your next question, which is, But Bill, I want to rip a 1/16 inch strip. How can I do that? Well, I'm going to tell you how to do that. I use 1/16 inch strips all the time, cherry, and I use them to run my drawers on. I put them on the inside of cases. So I want to rip off 1/16 strip off this piece of cherry. When I'm ripping, I want enough stock on the outside to give me enough mass to hold on to. So I glued the cherry onto a piece of pine. All right, I'm going to set the saw to 1/16 inch off the fence. And I'm going to raise the blade. That's the important thing. I have to do a test cut to see where the blade is raised to. Perfect. Molly, can you see where that? Can you see that little strip of wood that's left?
Yeah.
Okay, you got a good.
Yep.
I raised the blade just a little bit so that there is. It's a little thicker than a piece of paper. you go. Do one more. Before you run it through again, I'm going to take a sanding block, cut off anything that might be in there. Do it as many times as you want. Okay. One more rip cut. I want to rip 1/8 of an inch off there. And I can do it safely. Now I've already squared this end. That'll give me about 1/8 inch. The reason I didn't push that back in is I was unsure where that cutoff was. If the cutoff flops into the slot, then you don't want to push it back on. There's no pressure on this piece that you're holding with the push stick. It's not going to go left or right. The blade is trying to force it into the fence. All you have to do is hold it there. It takes minimal pressure. Okay, so that's how you can rip small pieces on this saw. I want to talk one more time about cross-cutting and why cross-cutting is safe on this saw. When you set it up, you're going to put one hand over here, 6-8 inches away from the blade. That hand isn't going to move. When you pull the blade through, there's nothing here that tends to pull that hand in. Well, it doesn't take much pressure. You're just holding that wood there. The other hand is on the handle. It can't contact the blade either. So when you saw, neither hand is moving toward the blade. Compare that with a table saw. I'll move it differently. When you cross cut on a table saw, whether you use a sled or whether you use a miter gauge, you've got 10 fingers moving toward the blade. The last thing I want to talk about is just woodworking safety in general. This is a blade that turns at 4,000 RPM. It's not a saw stop. If you put your fingers into it, it will be merciless. You won't have any fingers left. Your goal is to keep your fingers out of it. So here are the rules that I use. First, be a little bit afraid. You need a tinge of fear to make you stop and think. And what you have to think about is where your fingers will be before the cut, where your hands and fingers will be during the cut, and where your hands and fingers will be after the cut. That's really important. And the last thing I want to tell you is when using this saw slowly. Saw slowly. You won't make mistakes if you saw slowly. That's it. From Schenectady, New York. If you're visiting New York State, be sure to see Schenectady. It's a paradise. Thank you very much, folks.